Welcome to Part 2 of this lecture series. If you have not listened to Part 1, you may do so after Part 2 or Part 3. Keep in mind that the events discussed here today will be interpreted by looking at them through the lens of neo-progressive historiography, so some ideas may be presented differently than in your textbook or in class. That is okay. Understanding history from a variety of perspectives is helpful if you understand why historians have different views. This lecture will not go into particular depth in regards to any one topic, but tries to provide an interpretive critical analysis of events. Please use your textbook for details about events, including dates, names, and other specific data. For this section, we will discuss the colonial frontier and events leading up to the Revolution. For a moment, please review in your mind what you know about the colonial period. The colonials were, in essence, a frontier land for the English nation. People imported social and political ideals, but were remote enough that they had to start from scratch making homes, roads, tools to survive. Over time, settlements became more permanent, and England was able to establish several stable and profitable colonies. As you can see from this map, colonists moved out over time. Thus, some areas were more established, while there were areas that were still relatively primitive. As colonies became more stable and English merchants could make economic ties to the colonists, people made less of their material goods and purchased what they could. For instance, instead of making utensils from wood, they could buy pewter and copper utensils. But as colonists did better, some moved on to other lands and basically started the frontier process over again. During the early colonial period, there was a lot of risk, danger, and hope in the colonies. People depended on each other, and generally most people were in the same predicaments as their neighbors. At least in the early settlement, people were generally neither poor nor rich. Success was based on survival and the ability to work toward better situations in the future. Getting closer to the Revolution, some of the small settlements along the coast turned into small cities. These were not cities like we think of, but congregations of people from about 15 to 30,000, with services and shops as well as links to the outside world. The first cities were also ports and often were what might be called walking cities. People worked and lived in the same part of town. Taverns and coffee houses proliferated in these cities and were the center of news. Strangers coming in through the ports brought news, and locals gathered to discuss events. Here's a good example of a walking city. Philadelphia was home to people involved in the Revolution, and they lived within blocks of meeting places and government buildings. Taverns were the closest things to hotels, so the colonial leaders who came to work on revolutionary business would have stayed in the taverns in these neighborhoods. Colonial cities had more complex communities compared to the rural districts where most people fell within the middling class. In these cities, an urban elite worked within government and law and as merchants. These were men with education and wealth who used the services of the laboring classes. They had more servants than a typical family, and they used their time using their skills instead of their time just for survival. As you can see from this graphic, a small percentage of Americans, what we might call the elite, controlled the greatest amount of wealth in colonial America. Also, we can see by 1700, there was a group of poor folks whose situation would only get worse as they controlled less and less of the wealth over time. And you can see that right over here. Anyone walking down the street could tell from what class a person came. These images are of reenactors, but you can see that the laboring classes on the left wore clothes that could withstand the heat of fires or weekly washings to rid them of the sweat and dirt of hard work. The elite could wear silk and wigs to demonstrate their position in the upper class by not having to work with their hands or soiling their expensive clothes. There were also people in the colonies who did not fit in these categories. Indentured servants and slaves were forced to work and provided others with cheap labor. While some slaves and indentured servants worked on southern farms, they also worked on northern farms, in homes, and on docks in the port cities. These unfree laborers provided the colonial elite with the necessary services for survival and comfort, and freed them to pursue education, their careers, and leisure at home and abroad. Every colony had some number of slaves prior to the Revolution. Many people north and south also used indentured servants. An indenture was a contract for time, and you can see your textbook for more information on indentures. There were servants that worked for wages in people's homes who might have worked alongside unfree laborers as well. Everybody needed more help in rural and urban homes, and people got help from family or by finding others to join their households through indentures, wages, or purchase. Here you can see a graphic demonstrating the widespread use of slaves in the colonies. There may have been some free blacks mixed into these statistics, but those numbers would have been low in the colonial period. Here are some important numbers to note. Please make sure that you look at the fact that there were slaves in the North during the Revolution. And also take a look at the graph on the left. Over time, slavery became more important to fulfilling colonial duties to the mother country, especially in colonies such as Virginia. Just about the time that the number of indentured servants decreased, a small band of poor Virginia farmers led by Nathaniel Bacon struck back against elites and their control of land and the tobacco market. England responded to tobacco farmers' needs for cheap labor by authorizing the Royal Africa Company to bring slaves directly from Africa. To this point, most slaves had come from the West Indies. But now planters who did not want to rely on white indentured servants invested in slaves. When servants completed their indentures, they had all the rights of Englishmen. Bacon's rebellion made it clear that when they demanded rights, it might turn violent. With the change in labor, the South became marked by a racial caste system, with whites being free and blacks mostly being unfree. To this point, hopefully you can see the colonies were divided along class and race. Some people had more than others, whether that be money, power, or freedom. During the 17th and early 18th century, England had many troubles at home and abroad. This led to what historians call salutary neglect of the North American colonies. Colonists functioned without much supervision. There's the neglect. And this led to vibrant and profitable colonies. There's the salutary. But in England, after the Glorious Revolution, the nation was interested in reestablishing control over its colonies. Countries sought out colonies to help them build their empires and provided benefits to the colonies, including protection from other countries that might also want the resources in those lands. The great nations of the 18th century waged wars for their empires, and the events that sparked the French and Indian War also evolved into a greater world war known as the 7 Years' War. The British government sent troops to protect the colonists from the French and hostile Indians in the colonies, and the war created a great debt that the English people wanted to see paid. England increased taxes on the island, but also looked to the people who started the war to help pay the debt. After the French and Indian War, salutary neglect of the colonies was over. The English government also forbid the colonists from going into the frontier. That had caused one big mess that cost more than England could afford, and the Parliament did not want the colonists to start any more ventures that would cause another debacle. Many people know about the taxes that helped to cause the American Revolution, but most folks don't know all the facts. Tyranny seems to be enough of an explanation because even modern Americans chafe at the idea of paying taxes. But this doesn't give us the whole picture. Let's take the dreaded Sugar Act of 1764. Designed to help the British government pay down the debt that I referred to earlier, the Sugar Act actually lowered taxes. Colonists had been smuggling molasses into the colonies to avoid paying the original tax. Keep in mind that this meant, during war with the French, colonists were smuggling and trading with the enemy. Molasses, or sugar, was used at home by ordinary colonists on a daily basis, but merchants and ship owners who did the smuggling were the ones who made the money. In order to prosecute smugglers effectively, the English government also revoked trial by jury for the accused in these cases and put an appointed non-local judge in place to end the smuggling. The act cut down on smuggling, but colonists resented losing their rights to trial by jury. In Massachusetts, James Otis attacked the laws because they had, quote, a tendency to deprive the colonies of some of their essential rights, particularly the right of assessing their own taxes, end quote. Essentially, colonists were angry that instead of paying no tax illegally, they had to pay a smaller tax than expected in the first act. Here you can see the importance of molasses in the larger context of trade in the Atlantic world. The Sugar Act did not spark much protest, but Prime Minister George Grenville continued his policies by extending the stamp tax to colonists. British citizens already paid this tax in England, on the island, since 1694, so it seemed logical to extend it to the English colonies. Every document or printed item, newspapers, college diplomas, playing cards, needed to have a stamp to prove this tax had been paid. This meant that almost everybody had to pay this tax at some point. Couples getting married, merchants making contracts, old folks making wills, newspaper readers. In response, the colonial elite went into their legislatures to make official protests over the Stamp Act, and newspaper editors expressed their discontent in print. You can see the image on the right. First, the Virginians met in the House of Burgesses to write a strongly worded resolution against it. Others followed, and in late 1765, delegations from 9 colonies met in New York City in the Stamp Act Congress, which sent petitions to the king and Parliament. The colonists argued that the Parliament had no right to tax them because the colonists were not represented in Parliament. This wasn't exactly true, and we will discuss that in a moment. Groups known as the Sons of Liberty formed to terrorize stamp agents and burn stamps. The tax could not be collected because it required colonial cooperation. Back in England, the Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, that was in 1766, but made clear that the Parliament would make laws to, quote, bind, end quote, the colonies to England. This, however, set a pattern: tax, protest, repeal. Tax, protest, repeal. One last act deserves to be examined more critically. The average American might point to the greatest level of tyranny with the tax on tea. There is one problem with this. The Tea Act of 1773 that sparked the Boston Tea Party was not a tax. When it looked as if the East India Company would fail, Parliament intervened for the good of the entire empire by allowing the East India Company to sell directly to its English colonists. Ships with EIC tea came into numerous ports. Some were sent away, but the Boston governor made sure that 3 ships were allowed to dock. Colonial merchants feared unfair competition, and the power of the British government revived new anger in the colonies. Resistance leaders of 1770 used the Tea Act to excite people. This led to the boycott of tea and the dumping of the tea in the Boston ports. The English colonies had the right to tax its colonies because the colonies were a part of Great Britain. While the colonial elite were crying no taxation without representation, people on the island were confused. English colonists expected direct representation and low taxes, while Englishmen on the island paid high taxes and accepted the notion of virtual representation. Some areas of the island, like the colonists, so far away, did not have representatives, but felt represented because the House of Commons looked after the interests of all parts of the empire. But being down the road from London and being months away over an ocean created different circumstances. So that salutary neglect that made the colonies profitable also gave them too much independence early on. Fundamentally, however, the colonists ignored how expensive they were, and later, as a country, the Founding Fathers would have to grapple with the debts of their own. Ordinary colonists did not understand all the ins and outs of these laws, but the colonial elite did, and they often capitalized on local anger about events they understood because of their educations in English law and their time living in the colonies amongst these people. We will look at a few events in Boston that demonstrate the differences between the colonial elite and the middling people, which include laborers and artisans in the port cities. There were more efforts at taxing the colonists, and you can look to your textbook for those laws. But it was clear to the king and members of Parliament that the colonists were behaving badly. Rebellion called for order to be restored within these remote parts of the empire, and the government sent troops to protect government officials from being harassed, or worse. Bostonians were the most rebellious, having been a part of the smuggling and protest against taxes that resulted in an increasingly heavier hand over time, and had quite a number of troops in the city, which was a busy port. Alfred F. Young, in his article about George Hughes, a Boston shoemaker, gives insight to the lives of ordinary people in pre-revolution Boston. British regulars, the redcoats, had a dominating presence in terms of numbers and behavior. Soldiers took jobs from locals during their off hours, refused to pay bills owed to shopkeepers, were disrespectful to locals, and were generally an irritating presence. Their presence led to the murder of a child and the Boston Massacre. This article has been made available to your instructor if the content interests you. The murder of Christopher SEIDER is fascinating because it gives us a glimpse into the past in a way that events such as discussing boycotts generally just can't do. To set the scene, it was 1770. Boston. English colonists, especially in the busy port town of Boston, were upset with their government for various taxes and policies that seemed to hurt their economy. not just the economy of Boston or the colonies, but these policies hurt people's abilities to run their businesses and thus take care of their families. It was personal. Bostonians seemed to be the most rebellious toward English policies such as the Stamp Act, and Parliament sent redcoats to protect custom houses and tax collectors. As mentioned, these soldiers were rude, dangerous, and a bit out of control. More than just doing their job, they took liberties whenever possible to harass colonists and make an extra buck. So by February of 1770, it was more than just the Otises and the Adamses complaining about taxation without representation or trial by jury. But it was young boys who felt the tension in their town, who gathered together in small gangs to return the harassment toward those who had supported the government's policies, including merchants, soldiers, and officials. Sometimes referred to as Liberty Boys, these kids were the physical expression of Bostonian anxiety. But also they were just small mobs of kids wreaking havoc as young boys do, especially when they have permission of adults who could not act in such a way. So the target of the Liberty Boys on February 23, 1770, turned out to be a merchant named Lilly, who failed to uphold the boycott. These schoolboys and apprentices picketed his shop, angering another man, a local customs informer, Richardson, who decided to disperse the crowd by shooting into it. 11-year-old SEIDER was killed. Cool heads prevailed, and respected locals whisked him off to jail before he could be tarred and feathered. The term tar and feather has little meaning in the 21st century, but it had real meaning to folks in the 18th and 19th centuries. Here you can see a depiction of a colonist being tarred and feathered. This was hot tar that could be poured over flesh or clothing depending on the amount of punishment the mob wanted to give the person being punished, and tar would have been readily available in a port city such as Boston because it was used to fill cracks in boats and for waterproofing. This all fit well with the system of justice in the colonial period, considering its public nature. Englishmen of the 17th and 18th centuries considered their social reputations as important things to protect, and as a society, people then wanted to make sure that people who stepped out of line would be punished and lose social respect. Thus, most punishments were public events, such as being shackled to a whipping post or the pillory. The person perpetrating the crime received his or her punishment in front of others, and tar and feathering was similar but much worse than the whipping post. Not only was the initial punishment in public, but the perpetrator carried the feathers with him as a public display of his wrongdoing until they could be ripped from his flesh. And yes, I said ripped from his flesh. Then the scars, if he survived, would be a constant reminder to act in accordance with the will of the public. Tarring and feathering over clothes served as a big warning to someone who'd stepped out of place. Here's a picture of a person more recently tarred and feathered, in this case moderately. And you can see that both the tar and the feathers are stuck to his body. There were far more gruesome pictures to choose from, but I wanted you to see the reality of this action. So Richardson escaped this terrible fate, but the community continued to demonstrate their disapproval of government policies and their obvious consequences. At SEIDER's funeral, 500 boys marched behind the coffin during a funeral procession, and 2,000 or more adults followed the boys. This seemed to be one of the biggest colonial funerals of the time. Boston was a large port city for the time, but it still only had about 16,000 residents. So imagine 2,500 to 3,000 people out in response to this. You can imagine that this was an event that rocked the community, and we have seen events such as these recently in response to death resulting from police actions. So the pressure continued to grow, and this was not the last event that would rock Boston. A few days after the funeral, a fight with soldiers and laborers down at the dock ratcheted up the tension in the town. In retrospect, we now know that these events led up to the more famous Boston Massacre. So much so that even in the wake of the massacre, locals put SEIDER's name on the tombstone to honor those who died at the massacre. So at the time, Christopher SEIDER's death was not known to be so significant, but as the massacre happened, it was clear that this was a precursor to the events. With all that said, let's discuss the Boston Massacre. In 1770, the Townshend duties, like many other acts, had been repealed, but for Bostonians, the action taken by the Redcoats themselves had caused resentment. Bostonians were tired of being harassed by soldiers and customs commissioners collecting taxes So during the winter of 1770, fights here and there had been breaking out between soldiers and Bostonians. On March 5th, 1770, Liberty boys suited up again and pelted sentries at the custom house with rocks and snowballs. After learning about SEIDER's death, it is easy to see why local young men might be in the mood to throw a few rocks at the obvious agents of the policies that led to SEIDER's death. In the midst of the scuffle, soldiers fired and killed 5. This was a moment seized by the elite. The elite of Boston responded by publicizing the events to bring popular uproar against English policies. Editors printed articles about the men killed. Paul Revere depicted the scene visually and with a narrative to serve as a reminder of the massacre in Boston. Just using the term massacre was spin. He made it appear as a deliberate act instead of a tragic event in the midst of panic. The Boston Massacre became a symbol of British oppression. Samuel Adams continued to foment public outrage and called for a committee of correspondence in Boston. That's 1772. And other colonies followed. These committees publicized dissent against English taxation. This was an important first step to calling for revolution. These committees facilitated communication between the 13 diverse colonies. An elite in all of them could formulate ideas and make plans on how to respond to any new laws promulgated from the island. The events of the Boston Massacre demonstrate the differences between the elite responses compared to the ordinary subjects living in Boston. The elite had educations to help them consider arguments against British policies and the skills to disseminate them through printing presses and speeches. They could rally ordinary colonists, communicate with the elite of other colonies, and send their protests to England. In contrast, ordinary subjects of the British Empire lived among the redcoats or had little contact depending on where they lived. Prior to these events, the elite who wrote about the men killed at the Boston Massacre would not, most likely, have much concern for them. The victims came from the working class, and without these events they went unnoticed in everyday life. Most colonists lived and died with little public record for their existences. Because of these events, these men were given a lot of press. Yet with the depredations of the soldiers and the rallying cries of the elite, the common folk of Boston were willing to get ready for a fight in the form of militias with the redcoats and with Parliament. Women who were the shoppers of many items in cities such as Boston had much to do with the boycotts of British goods and took up spinning and weaving in protest. Men and women who had little to do with the conversations with Parliament bore the burden of boycott and war. Colonists were loyal to the English crown for the period before the war and even into the beginning of the war. So consider this question. What would make you angry enough to consider rejecting the American government and just start over? What kind of government would you form? Who should be the ones to say what kind of government it would be? The elite worked toward solving the problem between the colonists and their government for the early part of the war, and we will review more of that subject in part 3 of this lecture series. But for now I will leave you with this. If the colonists had not won the revolution, they would have been traitors. This explains some of the appeal of the consensus interpretation of history. And if this term means nothing to you, please go ahead and review part 1 of this series. I'll see you in part 3.